After a lot of research, careful planning, and a concerning amount of investigating that would put the NSA to shame, I'm going to be taking a shot at Password about David.
Bet you didn't see that one coming, huh?
As a disclaimer, I should point out most of what I'm going to say is going to be speculation and educated guesses built upon other theories yet to be validated, and what makes sense narratively speaking using both solid and circumstantial evidence from the game, as well as meta-knowledge gained from the Discord server, and other sources. I realize this entire video may be completely invalidated within a few months, but screw it. Whether I'm right or wrong in the end, it'll still be fun along the way. So buckle up, ladies and gents, this is gonna be a wild ride. So what exactly is this theory? David is alive. Or at the very least, only mostly sort of dead for now. So where do we even begin with a theory like this? Well, let me tell you, it took me literally months of gathering evidence and data to assemble this tangled mess of scraps into something remotely coherent. And even then, there's a lot of filling in the gaps that need to be done. So to say any of this is going to be straightforward would be a bold-faced lie, because I've got full Pepe Sylvia on this game again and am currently reading off a 12-page script. So I think the best place to start with David's aliveness is to start with what evidence we have and work from there. At multiple points in the story, Password makes it clear that David is dead. A little too clear. It's one thing that the first half of the story revolves around Dave coping with his depression concerning his father's passing. That only makes sense as it's kind of the point of his whole arc after all. But the game goes above and beyond what's necessary to drill this point into the ground. David is dead. Again and again and again. The lady does protest too much, methinks. It's kind of like why it's safe to assume Haas isn't up to anything nefarious, because despite how guilty he is all the time, it only stands to prove he's not actually guilty of anything at all. So when it comes to David's death, the game expertly leaves just enough information in the right places for another explanation that hasn't been expanded upon to take place. The obvious counter-argument to come up, however, is how would this even be possible? And if David is still alive and has failed to contact his son and wife for years at this point, traumatizing them, that would make him a pretty awful person, yeah? Indeed it would, as confirmed by Grizz himself. However, that's under the assumption him doing so was for self-interest. So what then if there was another reason? One perhaps a bit more noble. On day 14, Tyson relays everything that transpired the night leading up to David's supposed passing. There's two things of importance to note during this sequence. At one point, David explains he has to take care of something before leaving for work, but doesn't give any indication as to what that is. This could just be a narrative way to get him off screen for Tyson and Dave to interact, but the timing and ambiguity seems strange. Second, however, and much more importantly, David attempts to leave without saying goodbye to his son. According to the narration, this wasn't like him, and Dave calls him out on this, rushing outside to say goodbye anyway. What's imperative to note here is despite this, David still refused to say goodbye to his son directly. Before leaving, he also requests Dave to keep Tyson out of trouble, effectively passing a mantle of responsibility, almost as if he knew he wouldn't be returning to do so himself. What's key here is failing to say goodbye to a loved one is a classic trope in storytelling, when someone's about to go away on a journey or assumed suicide mission where they don't believe they'll return, especially if it's one of self-sacrifice. The side point of passing the torch of Tyson's well-being to Dave only affirms this further. So whatever David was going to do that evening was not his normal job as a police officer, which means it's safe to assume he likely didn't want Dave to be any part of it, potentially for his and Carol's safety. That same evening, David's partner on the force, Hoyt Barker, is the one to deliver the bad news to the family. This is important to note for a couple reasons. We know David was a cop, but something the story doesn't specify is what kind of cop he was. Was David just your run-of-the-mill gumshoe, or was he something more? Looking to his partner, we can make an educated guess. This sketch of Hoyt was released some time ago. It's clear by his uniform, the iconic tie and classic trench coat, that he's no average policeman, but instead a detective. So what might this mean for David? If there's one thing to be learned from practically any police series out there, it's that teams of two detectives make for good investigation work. So based on this trope, we can safely assume David wasn't just some random mall cop, but perhaps a detective himself. Using meta-knowledge, this is further supported by the fact that during the pseudo-Danganronpa class trial game that was held some time ago on the Discord server, Dave was specifically asked if he could act like his father for a time and help solve the murder at hand, to which he jumped at the opportunity. If David was just some generic policeman, and Dave knew this, why would that request invoke such an eager response? You don't send a traffic cop to sleuth a murder scene. You send a detective. Keeping what kind of policeman David might have been in mind, What then if he was at some point investigating what was going on at Hammond Manor, perhaps? And that's how he ended up getting involved with the vault. Additionally, given the nature of Memphis Noble and his ruthlessness to get what he wants, David may have reasoned, knowing the family already through Dave's friendship with Orlando, to keep his wife and son safe from a lunatic mob boss he would be putting himself at odds with, he needed to remove himself from the board entirely by faking his own death, thus ensuring Dave and Carol's safety by removing any potential leverage Memphis might try to utilize. To what extent or reason this might have been the case, we can only speculate, but it's a classic enough situation that would redeem David for his actions of abandoning his family. He wouldn't have done so to save himself or go into some sort of witness protection program. He would have done it to save his family, and possibly countless others given the vault's potential. This would paint David not as a disgraceful deadbeat father, but as a hero. What of others involved if this turns out to be true, however? You can't just fake a shooting by yourself, you know. By this logic, Hoyt would have been involved covering up specifics. After all we've got is concrete evidence of David's passing as the readers is Hoyt's word through Dave.
Nice. There was a funeral.
Shh. I'll get to that soon. Anyway, since we've received verbal confirmation from Grizz that Hoyt will make an appearance in the game at some point later down the line, outside of the flashback sequence, it's safe to assume more might be going on with the bull than we've seen already at very least. Next, Oz would also have to be involved, obviously. It would have been trivial of him to pay the police force to look the other way or falsify records. He certainly said as much as possible for people as wealthy as him. Plus, as a side conjecture, it's interesting to remember Oswin is currently protecting two specific individuals that are still alive that got involved with the vault some while back. While we don't know who these two people are specifically yet, narratively speaking, it might prove interesting if one of them turns out to be David. That's just speculation, however, with no actual evidence, mind you. Regardless, due to David's involvement with the vault, and potentially with Memphis Noble in a tangential sense, Oswin would logically have a vested interest in assisting with the plot, be it for his own sake or for other reasons. But what about the funeral, right? And to that, it's reasonable to respond, what about it? Which brings us to the last person in question. Carol. She's a trauma surgeon, a fact that isn't readily explained in the story until a fair ways in. It's an odd thing to just casually omit for so long, don't you think? But anyway, the notion of receiving her own husband at the hospital the night he was shot has been teased by Grizz a handful of times. But that's all it's been. Teasing. So other than potential, there's nothing to explicitly state she had to have been the one to intake the call. So her culpability as seeing evidence of David's passing is plausibly deniable. This translates over to the funeral as well. There was one, but nothing states David's body was ever seen at the time. In fact, we have almost no details on David's funeral at all, other than it happened. So evidence via Carol or the funeral in tandem are both speculative for now at best. The notion of a fake death aside, however, there are a number of other points throughout the story that insinuate the potential of David's vitality. During Oz's interrogation on day 8, you can ask about calling the police for help, to which Oswin callously responds that every cop has a price and can be bought. Dave refutes this to defend his father, and in return, Oz finds it amusing for some reason. Given Oswin's clear knowledge of who David and Dave are, this might have been a test to see Dave's reaction, which then begs the question, why even provoke Dave at all if there's nothing there? At the very least, we know Oz had something to do with Dave's disappearance, which can be inferred by Benson's pseudo-apology of what his family has done to Dave's family. There really isn't much else he could be referencing here after all. Next, Grizz has specifically stated before that a staple of good writing is if a character starts a story dead, it's safe to assume that they are indeed truly dead. While this is a fair argument, it could also be misdirecting. As given other comments by the man himself, there's a decent potential we didn't begin the game at the start of the story. Then there's the fact that if David was truly dead, Dave would have no doubt of that to be true. He even narrates as much, claiming his father's death is a fact he's sure of. Yet, as soon as David's license is uncovered, Dave changes his tune in the hopes his father might still be alive somehow. For someone who's so certain about David's passing, that hyena sure switched gears mighty quick. This could obviously be excused in that Dave was just hopeful and not wanting to accept the truth. But put yourself in this situation. I mean, really, if you knew someone who'd been dead for years, and a possession of theirs suddenly turned up at some random location you'd know they'd never been to, would the first thing that came to your mind be, are they really alive? No logical person would think that. More likely, you'd reason the item was stolen, if anything. If Dave legitimately knew for a fact that his father was dead, funeral and all, why would the driver's license have sparked potential hope to the contrary? But more importantly, why would that hope have been portrayed to us as the readers as so significant? Alas, however, one major and admittedly legitimate argument to bring up is if David is still alive, What would that mean for Dave's arc of learning to cope with trauma and loss? Could David's well-being endanger the game's core itself? The answer to that is, unfortunately, yes. But also maybe not. Assuming David is indeed still kicking, things could be set up in such a way so we could have our cake and eat it too. By day 14, not even halfway into the month, let alone the game, mind you, Dave has already taken the first steps to overcome his depression and grief. This is even stated directly by him in the narration, not to mention a noticeable tonal shift in his character as a whole from that point on. In a way, the fulfillment of Password's moral has already begun to take shape very early on before any inevitable action has happened. So then, what if David turns up later in the story, a while after Dave has begun the healing process and the readers have received the message that was intended? Could that be interpreted as icing on the cake? Maybe that'd be the supposed cliffhanger Grizz has planned. Admittedly though, all of this might be a stretch. So then what's a more logical solution we can draw concluding David's fate if we're barking up the wrong tree? Well, that's simple. Time travel. Okay, you can stop kicking up a fuss because I said time travel. Let me have my jokes. Anyway, let's now assume David is indeed dead, but not by the way that's been insinuated by the story so far, obviously. If David is dead, will he stay dead for the remainder of the game's story? The answer may surprise you, but to answer this properly, we need to jump over to a separate theory to build off of. One that I'm highly fond of, and if you've been following along, can probably guess already. Florencia Hammond as the Mastermind. Obviously, this topic deserves an entire essay itself, but that's a video for another timeline perhaps. For now, we'll keep things at the bare bones basis for relevance. On the assumption that Florencia is the mastermind behind everything going on at the manor, the longer the story of Password carries out, it's starting to become clearer her motives might have better intentions than originally speculated. Before you get the idea that I'm defending a murderer here, narratively speaking, this would make a lot of sense and fit the overarching theme of Password itself. It's common in stories for the quintessential bad guy usually to have an underlying motive for their actions that doesn't necessarily have to be inherently evil or self-serving. What makes them bad isn't always the person themselves, but rather the methods they use to reach their goal a lot of the time. If Florencia is the mastermind, she's been the orchestrator of multiple murders at this point with a lot more to come, even killing her own brother. But the question then remains, why? What purpose would killing some random kids and her only remaining family serve? Given her involvement with the Vault and Morphic Resonance device, we can extrapolate a reason using educated guesses. Password's overall theme is that of dealing with trauma and loss, as Dave himself has so depressingly demonstrated. So it would make sense narratively if the mastermind also fell into this idea in some manner. Dave lost his dad. So then, what or who did Florencia possibly lose? And to that, there's only one answer. Her brother, Reginald Hammond. Looping back around to her involvement with the Vault, how would this explain her actions? It's no secret people like Jack and Memphis Noble have incorrectly labeled the Vault as a time machine. This faulty reasoning is brought to light with Oz's reiteration of this fact on multiple occasions. The game wants us to understand this very early on. But why would we need to understand this? From Dave's interactions with the Vault, it's clearly messing with his head to the point where he's been able to actively recall memories from past timelines on command. Maybe not perfectly, but the potential is clear. If this side effect was known by Florencia, or if she experienced something similar herself, she could see the Vault as an opportunity to possibly bring a memory of future events into the past in a subsequent iteration of the timeline. Something akin to time travel, but obviously without the phone booth. If somehow helping or saving her brother Reginald is her end goal, this ability would be vitally useful. And because it would only be useful in the next timeline, all consequences in this timeline are off the table, because it wouldn't freaking matter. As Reginald would say, not this time around. But that's a rabbit hole for another time. As Haas explained, a safe lie is one that's seated in truth, and typically that there's someone there to corroborate at least part of it. This notion works in storytelling as well. If you want to surprise a reader, make sure they have enough information to realize something specific is flat out impossible, but leave just a smidge of room for doubt so when the rug is pulled out from under them, the fall isn't fatal. The Vault is not a time machine. It can't be used to hop realities, despite how fun that would have been. Oz is correct in this, but it's also evident Oswin doesn't fully understand how it works either, meaning there's room for expansion in its capabilities. A lie seated in the truth. Florencia is a clever girl though. It's reasonable to assume no matter how grief-stricken she might be over Reginald's passing, she likely wouldn't be so off her rocker to fail to see her goal wasn't possible at all. After all, she's gone to some pretty extreme lengths so far for it to all be for naught. a potential truth seated in a lie. So then, if we assume the vault can be used in a way Florencia might be hoping, what does this potentially mean for David? Quite simply put, a second chance. There are countless comments on the server where Grizz has specifically confirmed that there is going to be a happy ending to this game and a true timeline that will satisfy people. But what would such a resolution to the game actually entail? Admittedly, a technically good ending could simply involve the primary and supporting cast surviving the elements of the story and moving on with their lives thereafter, along with a metric buttload of grief counseling. That'd be the bare minimum to satisfy most readers. But what if the story went a step further, or rather, had the ability to go a step further? What if the ending of Password will eventually be presented with when everyone survives till the end wasn't the way the story actually ended, but instead was just a precursor of something better yet to come? What if what we theorized Florencia's plan all along to be, that of recovering future memories and bringing them into past subsequent iterations of the timeline, was eventually successful through Dave? All the events of the whole game could then be viewed as past iterations, leading up to the one true timeline. One where history may have taken a wildly different course. One where David never died. And perhaps even one where Reginald never passed away. Meaning, even if David is actually dead right now, he may not stay dead forever. This could result in what could be considered a truly happy ending for everyone, leaving a blank slate for the game's sequel. One that also wouldn't have to rely on the player's choices, while also rendering all the baggage and moral of the story just as important and canon as it would be otherwise. To have our Morphic Resonance cake and eat it too. In the end, only time will tell of David's true fate. And as stated at the outset, much of what we've discussed is based on speculation built on theories and educated assumptions. I don't profess that anything that's been said is concrete fact, though I'd be willing to bet at least some of it might be. There's enough puzzle pieces in this corner of Password's mystery that I think I can say with confidence a full picture is starting to take shape that I'm willing to put stock in. We aren't done with David's story yet. Not by a long shot. There's a lot more to this game to be told still, and even more mysteries to uncover. A lot more is to come, and I for one am looking forward to every second of it.